I'm Congressman Bill Johnson, and I want to thank you all for attending today's very important briefing on the state of COVID-19 in Sri Lanka and the impact that COVID restrictions and regulations are having on Sri Lanka's minority populations. While we continue to mitigate the impacts of the pandemic here in the United States, I appreciate you joining us again virtually for today's briefing. I'm also grateful to our esteemed panelists, most of whom are joining us from outside the United States, from both Sri Lanka and London, which is one advantage of having these events virtually, because we have the ability to hear from speakers from all around the world. As many of you know, as you just heard Representative Davis's Chief of Staff mention, Representative Danny Davis and I co-chair the Congressional Caucus on Ethnic and Religious Freedom in Sri Lanka. The focus of this caucus is to increase awareness and educate other members of Congress on the protection of human rights of all ethnicities and religions in Sri Lanka who are being excluded from society, the economy, the political life through discrimination, harassment, and persecution. As we've discussed in prior briefings, it's extremely disheartening that the Rajapaksa brothers are once again controlling Sri Lankan government. As we know, since their election, the Rajapaksa government has demonstrated their opposition, their blatant opposition to fulfilling the promised transitional justice reforms that they had previously committed to, that the government had previously committed to. The United Nations Human Rights Council has also reported on and condemned Sri Lanka's deteriorating human rights situation with the release of the Office of the High Commissioner's report and the passage of a UN resolution in March to ramp up international monitoring and scrutiny of the human rights situation there in Sri Lanka. Unfortunately, though, today's briefing focuses on the adverse impact that regulations and restrictions the Rajapaksa government has imposed due to COVID, how those regulations and restrictions are having negative impacts on minority populations, and how they're exacerbating civil and human rights violations. We've seen reports from reputable organizations, including Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, that police abuse has surged during the pandemic, including alleged extrajudicial killings, torture, and arbitrary detention. The forced cremation of all COVID-19 victims is also a very serious violation of religious freedom, especially for those of the Islamic faith, because as the very act of cremation is forbidden by Islamic law. Furthermore, the pandemic has detrimentally impacted Sri Lanka's economy, resulting in an economic emergency declared earlier this month. And I'm very concerned to hear of the resulting strict government control of essential goods and supply of basic food items. Although grim, I appreciate all of our panelists joining us today, and I look forward to hearing their perspective on how COVID-19 is impacting the ethnic and religious minorities in Sri Lanka. Now, Representative Davis was going to give some opening remarks at this point, but we'll wait until he gets here and let him do that if he's able to join us. Let me go ahead and introduce our panelists. First, we'll hear from Mrs. Anandi Sasidaran, who is joining us from Jaffna. Anandi is the Secretary General for the Party for Self-Government of Elam Tamils. She is also the former Minister of Women, Rehabilitation and Social Service for the Northern Provincial Council. She has served the community for 27 years in Jaffna, Mullaitivu, and Kilinochchi while witnessing the war. Anandi is the mother of 3 teenage daughters and a woman who turned over her husband Mr. Sasitharan as a prisoner of war to the Sri Lankan army at the end of the war in 2009. He is still missing. After losing hope in domestic mechanisms to find him, she is demanding international justice. Next, joining us from Colombo, we'll hear from Mr. Amir Faiz. Faiz is a practicing lawyer for over 30 years. He has a Master of Law degree with a focus in administrative human rights and international humanitarian law. In addition to his law practice, Faiz has been a civil and political activist. He is the chairperson for the Rural Development Foundation that promotes reconciliation amongst Tamils and Muslims in the North and the Northwest. He had been contributing to the constitutional positioning of the Sri Lanka Muslim Congress since 2001 and was its director of international affairs till February of 2021. Faiz is from Mannar in the north of Sri Lanka and works to ensure a correct narrative and the return of Northern Muslims. He has also been actively engaged with the UN Human Rights Council's process to promote reconciliation, accountability, and human rights. Next, we'll hear from J.S. Tisunayagam, who we've been fortunate to have speak at past caucus. Not sure what that was, but Tissa, it's great to have you with us, at least virtually again today. Tissa is a journalist who worked in English language national newspapers in Sri Lanka for over 25 years. As you may know, Tissa was arrested in 2008 for writing critically of the Sri Lankan government and was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Fortunately, due to an international campaign, he was released after 2 years. Upon his release in 2010, Tissa moved to the United States and became a Nyman Fellow at Harvard and a Reagan Fassel Fellow at the National Endowment for Democracy. Named Prisoner of Conscience by Amnesty International, he was awarded the International Press Freedom Award by the Committee to Protect Journalists in 2009, the Peter Macro Award for courageous and ethical journalism in 2009, and the British Press Freedom Award Foreign Journalist of the Year in 2010. He now contributes to Foreign Policy Magazine and Asian Correspondent, and is an Asian correspondent among other publications. Next, we'll hear from Ms. Darsha Jagunviswaran, who is the co-director of Adayalam Center for Policy Research, a human rights think tank based in Jaffna. She co-founded ACPR while being based in Jaffna between 2016 and 2018. Her research interests include the impacts of militarization, universal jurisdiction, and victim-centered accountability processes. Darsha holds an HBSc from McMaster University, a Juris Doctorate from the University of Toronto, and a Master's in Law from the London School of Economics. She is called to the bar in the province of Ontario, Canada. She is currently based in London in the UK. And last but not least, we'll hear from Mr. Alan Keenan, who is the Crisis Group Senior Consultant on Sri Lanka. He's based in London and he coordinates and contributes to the organization's research, publications, and advocacy on Sri Lanka. Alan has lived and worked in Sri Lanka for extended periods since first visiting in February 2000. He has a PhD in political theory and has taught at various US colleges and universities before joining Crisis Group in 2006. So we have quite an esteemed panel with us. Thanks again to each of you for joining us today. Please remember to our panelists, please keep your remarks to about 5 to 7 minutes so that we can allow for a question and answer session at the end of the briefing. And now let's turn it over to Anandi Sasidaran for her comments. Anandi, over to you.
I thank the caucus and the co-chairs for kindly allowing me to speak today at this important briefing. The spread of coronavirus from China has brought the world to a standstill, but China is trying to take over the world economy without any accountability. The corona epidemic has hit Sri Lanka hard recently. Sri Lanka, a developing country, has been completely looted by successive rulers. Large financial frauds have also taken place. The Divinaguma Lanka arms scandal of the Mahinda era and the central bank bailout scandal of the Maitri Ranil era are notable among others. Even so, the country has been able to move forward in spite of these problems so far. Physicians and professionals should be involved in the process to prevent the spread of the corona epidemic. Instead, the military is dominating the effort to stop the virus. How could military leaders who have been accused of war crimes in Sri Lanka be given responsibility to bring corona under control? Many hospitals in the northern province do not have thermometers to diagnose simple fever. How could these hospitals, which have not been given sufficient resources, find out a way to diagnose and treat corona? Travel bans and curfews have made it very difficult for people to make ends meet. The government is unable to fully implement relief programs to help people who are deprived of their livelihoods, so people are suffering tremendous hardship. The government did not allow the corpus of Muslims who died of coronavirus to be buried according to their religious customs, a clear instance of discrimination. The government, which bans Tamil commemorative events in the name of corona, is at the same time carrying out singular ceremonies without any guidelines. The government, which imposes the travel ban on Tamils, builds Buddhist temples in occupied areas in the northeast with the chanting of monks. Today, the government seeks to impose the corona ban on the people when voices are raised against it. On the whole, the Sri Lankan government is using the corona as a tool to stifle democratic voices raised against itself. I am sure that my fellow speakers will discuss some of these issues in more detail. Thank you for allowing me to summarize the problems of the current moment from my perspective in Jaffna. I am happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Let's go now to Faiz.
Thank you, Senator Bill Johnson. This is a challenging time for religious minorities in Sri Lanka. Violence against ethnic and religious minorities is posing a serious threat to their peaceful and dignified existence. The religious minorities under threat include Christians, Hindus, and Muslims. On May 15, 2020, while the country was under lockdown due to pandemic, a naval contingent was established to protect a Buddhist temple and its surrounding lands in the southeastern coastal town of Pothuவில், which is inhabited by Tamils and Muslims. This is widely viewed as a move to evict the Tamils and Muslims from that area. We also witness a recent trend where Hindu devotees are being prevented from worshipping and engaging in religious practices in ancient Hindu temples. Early this year, in the eastern town Kanya, when renovation was being carried out, a Buddhist Dagaba was placed where a Hindu idol stood on the basis that the place was originally Buddhist. In North Nedukkunari, a Hindu priest and 2 others were arrested when they went to perform an annual ritual, claiming they were trying to damage archaeological monuments. These are only 2 examples. Additionally, lands used by Tamils and Muslims traditionally for various purposes, including grazing, are being usurped arbitrarily under the patronage of state officials. There has been structural violence against Christians, including the involvement of state officials. In 2020, many pastors were questioned about their religious practices, the registration status of their churches, and the personal details of their congregants. Despite there being no law, there is bureaucratic restrictions on new construction of places of worship when it comes to minority religions. Since the end of the war in 2009, Muslims have increasingly become the target of hatred, state-sponsored injustices, and violence. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights is being abused and weaponized to arrest Muslims arbitrarily and to incarcerate them for exercising their right of freedom of expression and dissent. This is more so after the Easter Sunday terrorist bombings in 2019. In contrast, the hate-mongering extremist monks, mobs, and media enjoy impunity. There are over 250 Muslims continue to be in prolonged detention without being charged. In the meantime, on the 12th of March 2021, that is during pandemic, an additional set of regulations have been issued under the much maligned Prevention of Terrorism law titled De-radicalization from holding violent extremist religious ideology. These regulations aimed at Muslims, although temporarily have been stayed by the Supreme Court, would permit subjective assessment on and labeling of individuals guilty of having entertained thoughts, again, without subjecting such individuals to judicial scrutiny. These measures and detentions have been highlighted in the EU Parliament's urgency resolution adopted in June and in the oral update of United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights dated 13 September 2021, which Senator Bill Johnson was kind enough to refer to. The government has used the pandemic to politicize existing anti-Muslim sentiments. Initially, the Muslims were accused of being the introducers and carriers of virus. Powerful media houses aligned to the government promoted stories that painted the Muslims as unpatriotic and undisciplined. There was racial profiling against Muslims as a group. In this backdrop, and to further the hatred against religious minorities, the government derogated from the constitutionally protected fundamental right of the Muslims to bury their dead who had fallen victim to COVID-19. From 31st of March 2020, all the dead, either of COVID or suspected of COVID, were forcibly cremated against the wishes of the respective families, which I'm thankful that Senator Bill Johnson referred to. The decision of forcible cremation was arbitrary and not scientific. We were compulsorily cremating the dead, whilst the entire world and the WHO had no issue of burying their dead due to COVID-19. It was only after widespread condemnation and at the UNHRC, UN Human Rights Council session early this year in February, March, that too, pending a possible UNHRC resolution, the government lifted the ban conditionally on the burial of COVID-19 victims. In that, to date, there is only one designated place where the burial of the dead of COVID is allowed in the far eastern town known as Gotabaya, which is easily more than 250 kilometers, nearly 160 miles away from Colombo. This poses a serious challenge and hardship to the Muslims. The process remains very complex and painstaking. No family member is yet allowed to have even a peek at the burial ritual or to visit the site thereafter, as the site is heavily guarded 24/7. This difficulty continues to deter the Muslims from approaching treatment centers. That is another main worry. Despite repeated requests, the demand for deep burial in close proximity or at least in one place in each province has not yet been heeded to. Even there is discrimination towards minority religions when it comes to cultural practices. For example, the Archbishop of Colombo called for a black flag protest to be held from the August 21st this year against his studied dissatisfaction about the investigation related to the Easter Sunday terrorist attacks. On the eve of the 21st, the government clamped a lockdown, effectively preventing the proposed black flag protest. In contrast, the famous annual Buddhist cultural pageant known as Esala Perahara that was going on in Kandy since 13th August, without spectators though, but involving thousands of dancers, was allowed to continue till its scheduled conclusion on the 23rd. Similarly, more recently this month, permission to hold another equally important religious event of the Hindus in the northern town of Nallur was restricted within the temple premises sans any worshippers. Here, my point is, I'm not advocating for religious feasts or festival during the pandemic, but drawing the attention as even such are being treated discriminately. For want of time, I'll stop there, but first, underscoring that this threats, abuses, and discrimination, it is imperative that friends and well-wishers take every possible step to ensure equal protection of Sri Lanka's ethnic and religious minorities and their human rights. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Faiz. Let's go to Tissa now.
Thank you very much, Congressman Bill Johnson, for your kind remarks and your kind introduction. And thank you very much for inviting me to speak this morning here. And it's also nice to see old friends on this panel, some of them whom I have not met for over a decade. Sri Lanka's democracy deficit worsened since the coronavirus began spreading in the country from March 2020. This is because, like many other countries, Sri Lanka believed restrictions on individual and collective freedoms imposed due to a national health emergency was a good opportunity to ramp up control over citizens by using illegal and often unconstitutional means. I wish to use the time allocated to me to speak about the fetters placed on the media and freedom of expression by the government of President Gotabaya Rajapaksa. This is because whether it be militarization or shoddily constructed institutions of transitional justice to investigate past crimes against humanity, or ongoing restrictions on memorialization, they have provoked questions and drawn protests from the Tamil public. And when the Tamil media has tried to report on these acts of dissent, they face backlash from the government. Both during the time of the pandemic and before, the Tamil media has come under much greater suppression than its Sinhala and English counterparts. And journalists covering dissent and protests in Sri Lanka's north and east, where Tamils and Muslims form the majority population, have met with far greater repression than in other parts of the country where the Sinhalese are the majority. The main enabler of violence against the Tamils, including the Tamil media, is the law. Draconian counter-terrorism legislation like the notorious Prevention of Terrorism Act, which Faiz also mentioned, or the PTA, has been used predominantly against Tamils, but is now increasingly used against the Muslims. The PTA, through an overbroad definition of terrorism, has been used to criminalize even legitimate dissent, such as nonviolent public protests, and the journalists covering those events and publicizing it. The PTA has also had other features that subvert international law, such as facilitating prolonged detention, which facilitates torture, and confessions admissible as evidence in court. More controversial is the recently added regulations to the PTA on de-radicalization, which also Faiz referred to in a moment, but which a moment ago, which has also other features such as that it allows the magistrate to order 2 years rehabilitation for a person against whom no legal charges can be brought. Under emergency regulations too, a similar clause enables 2 years of rehabilitation for persons either arrested or those who surrender to the state. The ICJ has condemned this as arbitrary detention, and it is no different from the re-education camps for Uyghurs in China. Other legal restrictions on the media are government-issued instructions to the police to take legal action against those who publish posts in the social media or criticize the government or criticize government officials using obstructing their duties. Sri Lankan citizens have been arrested and charged under these regulations. Here are 4 emblematic cases of the suppression of Tamil media during the public health crisis caused by the pandemic. The first, journalist Murugappillai Kogaldasan, known as Gokul, was detained under the PTA by the Counter-Terrorism Investigation Department for almost 1 year without charges for allegedly publicizing photographs of the rebel LTT on his Facebook page. According to Reporters Without Borders, days before his detention, he raised questions about the rights of Tamils to commemorate Maveerar Naal, or Great Heroes Day, held in November to commemorate the Tamil war dead. Second, last week, on September 23rd, Selvakumar Kajendran, a member of parliament, was arrested in Jaffna for violating rules banning gatherings to prevent the spread of the coronavirus. This was while Kajendran was memorializing the death of Lieutenant Colonel Thilipan, an event commemorated throughout the northeast of Sri Lanka. And the event was in the open air and was a private ceremony. But more to the point, 2 female citizen journalists who were filming the incident had their phones forcibly taken away by the police. Although on this instance, the phones were returned to the owners, the police regularly destroy cameras by journalists, used by journalists to intimidate them. Third, Tamil journalists are threatened to keep away from reporting dissent by the police, summoning them repeatedly for interrogation. In November 2020, for instance, Batiklo Press Club Secretary and Tamil Guardian correspondent Selvakumar Nilandan was questioned extensively for reporting a land grab in Batiklo by Sinhala farmers that had dispossessed Tamil pastoralists. Then again, on July 12, 2021, Nilandan was summoned by the CTID and interrogated for over 3 hours and asked questions about his personal finances and his connections to the LTT. The 4th instance, on February 1st, the Batiklo police handed a restraining order to journalist Punyamurthy Sasiharan, who was restricted organizers of a peaceful march by mostly Tamils and Muslims, known as P2P, because the protest would spread the COVID-19 pandemic. He refused to accept the order, saying that he was a journalist covering the protest and not an organizer. These are but a few recent incidents of intimidation and arrest by which the government has sought to impose greater control over the Tamil people's freedom of expression and the Tamil media. The immediate consequence of this has been its impact on the national debate about the pandemic and its effect on national life. Government restrictions on the publication of the truth in the media is such that there is not even agreement on how many deaths have occurred due to the pandemic. Further, there is a widespread fear of getting vaccinations in Tamil towns such as Kilinochchi and Mullaitivu because the vaccines are Chinese products and it is the military that distributes and administers those vaccines. But these concerns too are not highlighted in the media. Having said that, the imposition of restrictions under COVID-19 regulations by the Gotabaya Rajapaksa government is not peculiar to this regime. Curbing the freedom of the media citing a national emergency is systemic and structural. It has been deployed for the flimsiest reasons in the past too. The Press Council law that criminalizes libel goes back to 1973. The PTA was enacted in 1979, while emergency regulations is a colonial relic added to by successive Sri Lankan government.
I hate to interrupt you, but could you begin to wrap up so we can make sure we get to all the panelists before we go to questions?
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
And because it is systemic, the PTA has been deployed against, in the past, against Tamil journalism, is now being increasingly used to stifle Sinhala and the English media and intimidate Muslim and Sinhala writers too. One of them is the Muslim poet and teacher Anaf Jasim. Jasim has been detained for over 1 year under the PTA and subjected to torture, allegedly for his poetry, exposing students to extremist ideologies, claims yet to be substantiated. And this is despite his anthology of poems written in Tamil is listed in Sri Lanka's National Library catalogue. There are other instances, such as journalist Kirti Ratnayaka, who is a Sinhalese, who was also taken in by the PTA, and another journalist, Manilal Abeku, who was arrested by the police for covering a protest and was tortured by the police. And I won't go into those details because of a paucity of time. As mentioned earlier, one of the reasons—
Tissa, we're going to have to wrap up, my friend. We're going to have to wrap your comments up, please.
Okay, can you give me another minute, please, Congressman?
One more minute.
Yeah, okay. As mentioned earlier, the reason why this coercion against the Tamil media is now being extended to the Sinhala journalists and the Sinhala media is because of restrictions on the freedom of the press is systemic. But there are other reasons as well. The other, which is that from 2015 to 2019, during the Sirisena Wickremesinghe government, there was ample opportunity to address systemic racism in the media and expand media freedoms. But large sections of Sri Lanka's civil society and its international backers did very little. At that time, to preserve a facade of democracy, they were happy to proclaim that space had opened up to the media to discuss controversial political issues. But while space did open up to discuss politics in the Sinhala areas, vital questions pertaining to the civil war did not. Crimes against humanity committed against the Tamils in Mullawaikal, where 40,000 Tamils were killed, and allegations against Sri Lanka's military for committing those crimes did not become part of that national debate. Now that the fig leaf of democracy has disappeared before the onslaught of Rajapaksa's authoritarianism, Sinhala Buddhist racism earlier directed against the Tamils is spreading to the Muslims, and dissent by the Sinhalese against the regime is being brutally suppressed, including in the Sinhala and English media. I ask Congress to use all the tools in its diplomatic toolbox and please place genuine and sustained pressure on the government of Sri Lanka to achieve justice, accountability, and democracy, which is the only way for genuine peace and reconciliation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to Darsha.
Thank you. Thank you to the caucus and co-chairs for having me speak today. As many of the speakers have already outlined, the impact of COVID-19 in Sri Lanka has been dire, both in respect of its tragic death toll, but also on its impact on the rights and freedoms of already marginalized communities on the island, including Tamils, Muslims, and also other communities such as human rights defenders and journalists. I will try to contain my presentation to 3 points in light of the fact that lots of the other speakers have already covered many of the important aspects to this. First, I will look at how the Sri Lankan government has used COVID-19 to further militarize civilian authorities. Then I will consider how COVID-19 regulations have been weaponized to stifle dissent, freedom of expression, and also memorialization. And finally, I will consider how COVID-19 has impacted human rights defenders and civil society on the ground in Sri Lanka and their ability to function. While much of what I will describe has been happened in the context of the pandemic, I do think it is important to make the same point that Tisanayagam has made, which is that the deterioration of human rights in Sri Lanka is not a result of the pandemic, but has rather been exacerbated by it. Since the election of Rajapaksa in November 2019, the government has taken a strictly Sinhala Buddhist nationalist agenda with little regard to Tamil, Muslim, and other numerically smaller communities on the island. This ideology has underpinned Sri Lankan electoral politics since independence, and thus any steps we consider in the context of the pandemic must be read in this wider context. First, turning to the militarization of civilian authorities. While much of this may seem obvious, I do think it's important to really look at the mechanics of how it happened. When the pandemic struck Sri Lanka, the government quickly decided to task the issue of coordinating the pandemic response to two entities: the National Operations Center for the Prevention of the COVID-19 outbreak, and then a presidential task force, which has been a real feature of this government, the creation of endless presidential task forces to deal with various issues that are staffed with security sector members as well as members of the Rajapaksa clan. The first entity, the National Operations Center, is headed by Lieutenant General Shavendra Silva, the commander of the army and a credibly accused war criminal. I think what was really striking about this appointment was it happened a month after the US State Department banned Silva from travel to the US due to his involvement in extrajudicial executions. In addition to being a credibly accused war criminal who was banned from international travel to the United States, he also has no background in public health, which is something that you would expect the person tasked with heading up the response to the pandemic to have. The other entity, the presidential task force that was set up, was headed by Basil Rajapaksa, the brother of Gotabaya, who also has no public health background. This task force included several members of the security forces, and the International Truth and Justice Project has actually done a detailed deep dive into the backgrounds of several of these individuals, demonstrating that many of them carry a history of serious human rights violations. In addition to these two main entities, a number of individuals were tasked with minor functions within the COVID-19 response, and they happened to be security sector actors because the truth was that under Gotabaya, he very quickly consolidated heading up various task forces in Sri Lanka with security sector actors. This ranged from the Task Force for Poverty Eradication to the Disaster Management Center, and all of these institutions were brought under the auspices of the Ministry of Defense. And in that way, they really quickly militarized civilian authorities in Sri Lanka, eradicating civilian ability to kind of address these issues. The military was also given charge of enforcing curfew passes, which gave the military a free pass to increase surveillance and intimidation, primarily of Tamil and Muslim communities based in the north and east, but also across the island. And I think the use of the military to manage COVID-19 is especially troubling in a country like Sri Lanka, where the military stands accused of horrific atrocity crimes. Not only does this give more power to an institution that has a culture of impunity for torture, sexual violence, and other crimes, but it also sows further seeds of distrust in Tamil and Muslim communities who were victims of these crimes. Asking war-affected Tamil communities, for example, to attend army-run vaccination centers only creates more suspicion around the vaccine. After the end of the war, for instance, many Tamil ex-combatants were subjected to rehabilitation camps, and I use that quotation because they were very much instead torture and sexual violence centers. And they reported being given injections that they later said made them unwell. So you can imagine the army handing out vaccines is not going to be met with any sense of trust. And I think that kind of covers the point around militarization, and I'm happy to answer questions about it later as well. Turning to the second point, so a number of speakers have touched on how during the pandemic, the government has really cracked down on freedom of expression, freedom of association, and dissent. And I think, again, returning to, well, how did that happen? What were the mechanics of this? Sri Lanka did something that I think we're seeing increasingly in repressive regimes around the world, which is weaponize the law and existing regulations to give their actions a semblance of legitimacy. They put in place questionable curfews that had very little legal basis. They used COVID-19 regulations to arrest tens of thousands of individuals under this curfew law. They used those regulations to then prevent communities from protesting. Despite these protesting community saying that they would comply with public health and safety measures and the fact that social gatherings were still permitted at the same time. Police officers filed reports to magistrates' courts in advance of these protests under a public nuisance law in Sri Lanka, section 1061 of the Criminal Procedure Code. Now, for those who are familiar with Sri Lankan law, this is not an appropriate use of that provision. And actually that provision is not meant to be used to infringe on freedom of expression and other rights. Yet they still did that. They sought to justify bans on memorials the same way. And in doing so, also continue to monitor social media. And others have already touched on the fact that there was an increasing kind of surveillance of social media during this period. I think it's worth noting that on April 1st, 2020, so about a month into the pandemic, the acting inspector general instructed the police to take legal action against individuals who publish posts on social media criticizing government officials. And the absurdity of this, I think, is really highlighted in this one case where a middle-aged woman was arrested after posting a message on Facebook alleging the president had COVID-19. She spent a week in prison for doing so. And so I think
Darsha, I hate to interrupt you, my friend, but if you could begin wrapping up too, that would be helpful.
Yeah, of course. So I just to wrap up that point about the weaponization of law, the distortion of the law to prop up state regimes isn't a unique phenomenon. We've already spoken about the PTA as a clear example of this, but I think the COVID-19 pandemic really gave more credence to this. And then my third and final point, which I'll make very briefly, is that there has also been a crackdown on civil society that has been exacerbated by the pandemic. I know a number of colleagues have spoken about high-profile arrests of journalists and lawyers, but I think it's worth noting the day-to-day function of civil society organization and NGOs has also been impeded. There's been repeated visits from TID officers. Most NGOs have been subjected to some form of investigation from the Terrorism Investigation Department. There's been a huge push to bring NGOs, including Adialam, within the NGO Secretariat, which is now under the Ministry of Defense. And without kind of speeding through this, I think there is a real sense that there's an inability to function on the ground there to the level where Adialam, for example, doesn't publish anything anymore because there's a sense of self-censorship that has to happen to survive. And so I think in conclusion, the impact on COVID-19 on rights and freedoms in Sri Lanka can't be overstated. It really sped up an erosion of human rights on the island, and it enabled the government to commit these violations with some semblance of legality and legitimacy. So it's important that international actors such as the United States look beyond the apparent justification of such draconian measures and ensure that relations with Sri Lanka are made conditional on an end to human rights violations and demilitarization as a start. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much, Darsha. We're going to go to Alan Keenan now. And before you begin your remarks, let me tell everyone, Laura Wilson from my office is going to be handling the Q&A because I have to exit now for another meeting that I've got to get to. But thank you all for joining us today. Alan, over to you. I'm sure you're gonna share some important information with the folks as well.
Okay, thank you, Congressman Johnson, and Congressman Davis. Thank you for the invitation. It's been interesting to see everybody's presentation so far. I'm glad everyone's going over some very detailed specifics on the topic because that's not what I'm going to do. I'm going to instead focus on kind of the more overview of where this all leaves us and how to proceed from here. So I think with the Rajapaksa government now confronting a trio of grave challenges, economic, health, and political, and facing greater international scrutiny and domestic protest, recent government statements have presented a friendlier face and returned to the language, if not yet the practice, of reconciliation and human rights. So I'm going to focus on how to respond to this new charm offensive, as I call it. With the Rajapaksa government almost certainly unwilling to make a fundamental shift away from its nationalist, militarized, and authoritarian style of governance, the government's current charm offensive is likely at best to produce marginal policy changes, which they intend to use as justification to end the oversight from the Human Rights Council. Recognizing there is little near-term chance of addressing the underlying drivers of intercommunal conflict or achieving accountability for past rights violations or restoring the rule of law, The US government, working closely with the UN and other influential governments, should use the increased leverage provided by Sri Lanka's multiple crises to encourage policies that limit the risks of further deterioration in democratic governance and a return to large-scale rights violations and political violence. In particular, US engagement in and with Sri Lanka should focus on the following 3 priorities: defending democracy by working to keep open the space for political debate and dissent and for free elections and for the basic principles of the rule of law that these depend upon. 2, preventing a return to violent conflict, in particular by working against the demonization of Muslims, the continued marginalization of Tamils, and the growing conflict risks that these bring. And 3rd, keeping the UN Human Rights Council process alive as the best, however inadequate, forum for keeping international attention on the 2 priorities above. This will require denying the government easy propaganda victories that strengthen their hand in Geneva by allowing them to claim to be addressing reconciliation or truth or accountability, when in fact they are not. This will require insisting on tangible and meaningful improvements in rights protection, while recognizing that the current government is almost certainly incapable of addressing the deep causes of Sri Lanka's longstanding governance problems. So as some of you will in this meeting will already know, there's been a recent claims by the Sri Lankan government at the UN and both in New York and in Geneva. They presented a list of all their supposed achievements along the lines of reconciliation, truth, accountability. I think if we look at them closely, we'll see that there's not much of a there. We don't have time to go into it, but I'd be happy if there's any questions from any of the audience about the specific claims they're making. But it's clear that the government has yet to make or promise any concrete policy changes for the most important goals, that is to restore the independence of rule of law institutions, to pursue accountability, to reduce militarization, or to move away from divisive single and nationalist politics. That's not on the agenda. Instead, what's on the agenda is an attempt to present a more friendly face to Western governments and the UN in an attempt to ultimately extract the government from the continued monitoring by the Human Rights Council. So in developing a response to Sri Lanka's revived promises of reform, the US and other key international actors should work from 2 assumptions. First, that the Rajapaksas are working to avoid another unpleasant electoral surprise like they suffered in January 2015 by shutting down the possibility of future democratic transfers of power. They are aiming to get through the current period of economic and political vulnerability and to win enough time to further entrench themselves in power. Key to this strategy is to end the quote unquote the Geneva process and the unwelcome attention and possible negative trade and investment and financial consequences it could bring. Ideally, the Rajapaksas and their military allies would also like to reduce the existing small pressure for accountability, though the threat this poses to the regime as a whole is negligible. International engagement in Sri Lanka should also work from the assumption that under the current government, Sri Lanka's fundamental governance challenges are certain to remain unaddressed and will require continued long-term engagement from internationals and from the UN. These fundamental challenges, as I would put them, are threefold. 1, to restructure the state in a way that recognizes the country's ethnic and religious pluralism, offering a political solution to Tamil aspirations for an equitable share of power, and ensuring the security and equal status of Muslims. 2, to strengthen the rule of law institutions and challenge institutionalized impunity. And 3, to see the state and the Sinhala public acknowledge at least some of the truth about what happened in the war, and for all communities to acknowledge the depth of suffering experienced by others. With major reforms along these lines out of the question, the best that is likely to be achievable for the next few years is to prevent things from getting worse, to keep the peace through better protection of minority rights and the rule of law, and to preserve the chances of democratic change and renewal by keeping open the space for public criticism and debate, and by maintaining the laws and institutions necessary to free and fair elections, which could well be under threat. What is needed now are international efforts in support of policies that keep space alive to deal with the harder and more fundamental issues at a later date and almost certainly by a different government. So just to conclude, among the achievable goals I think the US and like-minded states should press for strongly now are 1, preserving democratic space by pressing the Sri Lankan government to keep the democratic space open through appeals to abandon the proposed law to regulate NGOs, through active support for human rights defenders at risk, and through the protection of electoral integrity. Second, PTA reform. While continuing to call for a repeal of the PTA and for any replacement legislation to be fully compliant with international human rights norms, the US and others should begin pressing for a moratorium on the application of the PTA immediately. This should be made clear as an essential signal that the Sri Lankan government is serious about PTA reform, without which one cannot take them as being serious. Three, they should press for the immediate, expedited and fast, if not immediate, release of the scores of prisoners that have been detained under the PTA for years, some for decades, some without even being charged, much less convicted. Three, on Muslim rights, the US should lobby against the further demonization and humiliation of Muslims, especially through the proposed regulations for de-radicalization camps and the increased risks of violent reaction this brings from small numbers of the community. Should ensure that programmatic support for quote unquote preventing violent extremism and counterterrorism doesn't inadvertently support government narratives where Muslims, not Buddhists, are the only religious extremists. As this is very hard to do in the current context, most, if not all, such programming should be avoided or dropped. And finally, Tamil rights. The US and others should keep alive the continued importance of addressing legitimate Tamil political concerns and community rights, which unfortunately have fallen basically off the political agenda, and especially in the last few years. In the current context, with a president known to oppose provincial devolution, the focus will likely need to be limited to preventing the weakening of the 13th Amendment and pressing for the revival of provincial councils through elections as soon as possible under existing electoral law. Of course, much more is needed ultimately, but very unlikely to get with this government. So that's my sort of minimalist approach, my minimalist and preventive and rights-oriented approach that I would recommend the US and other governments to pursue. Thank you, and look forward to the questions.
Okay, as Congressman Johnson mentioned, unfortunately, he had to step out for another meeting. I'd like to get started with the Q&A session. If you have a question for the speakers, if you could please write it in the chat box. I have one to start, and it's addressed to the whole panel if anyone has any comments on it. We've kind of heard this morning from all of our speakers blatant examples of discrimination against ethnic and religious minorities and an abuse of current law under the guise of the pandemic by the Sri Lankan government to further suppress these populations. In what ways can international pressure help in these circumstances? And I know Darsha and Alan both got into this a little bit. I'm not sure if you had anything extra you wanted to add or if any of the other speakers had anything they'd like to contribute as well. And I apologize for the bells.
Yeah, I'm happy to go, Ellen. I know you've already sort of covered off your steps, which I agree with. But I think generally speaking, the Sri Lankan government, while kind of portraying quite a strongman image, is incredibly vulnerable for the reasons that have been outlined. Economically, they are on the verge of collapse. And internally, I think what happens with the Sri Lankan government when that does happen is they tend to get even more repressive. And so I think now is the time to make clear that trade, military to military relationships, any kind of interaction with the Sri Lankan government is going to be done on a conditional basis and a kind of human rights first approach. I think we've seen mistakes in the past where governments have been too keen to kind of reward like seemingly positive steps by the Sri Lankan government without actually seeing them through. I think the repeal of the PTA is a really great example. And so I feel like that's sort of the direction that I would encourage international governments to go in. That now is not an approach to try, like as Alan has outlined, now is not the time to kind of fall for the superficial gestures that the Sri Lankan government is making to appease the international community, knowing full well that given electoral dynamics at home, it's very, very likely that they're going to continue down this road of increasing repression.
I guess I have one follow-up for you, Darsha. While trying to put pressure on the Sri Lankan government, are you concerned at all that too much pressure will push them more towards being more cooperative with the Chinese versus Western culture? Do you see China as a problem in this sense?
I'm not sure that I'm the best equipped to answer that question, so I'm happy to pass that off to one of the other speakers. But I mean, from my perspective, I think we have to resist the kind of urge to frame this in the sense of China versus everyone else in Sri Lanka, because I think when we do that, people who pay the price ultimately are communities, marginalized communities in Sri Lanka. And I think we have to kind of take a more principled approach. But yeah, I'm happy to pass that off to anyone else.
Yeah, could I just jump in quickly? I see one of the questions in the, a couple of the questions in the chat are to me. I mean, I guess just to clarify, I agree with everything Darsha just said. Just to clarify, I think there's like 3 levels of possibility, okay? I mean, there's the gestures that the Sri Lankan government is making now. You know, some extra compensation to war victims, the promise of expedited searching for the missing, you know, revived Office of National Unity and Reconciliation, which never really did anything of any importance. Some small things which I think we can dismiss as just, you know, gestures designed to look good. Then there's a middle category. Then there's the big category of what I call the fundamental issues, which this government is not going to touch. They're not going to try war criminals. They're not going to restructure the Sri Lankan state to be more inclusive for, you know, Tamils and Muslims and other numerical minorities. They're not going to do a whole bunch of other things. Then there's the middle, right, where I think there are possible tangible wins which you could get. For instance, the release of PTA prisoners. For instance, a moratorium on the PTA. Difficult, but you can imagine with the proper pressure, the government would give on some of those. They might resist moving, pull back from their worst excesses, like an NGO law, which will, you know, make it very hard for NGOs to function, or an electoral law, which will skew the electoral playing field entirely in their favor. Certain things, or the continued humiliation of Muslims that could possibly provoke some small number into further violence, a whole range of other things. I think there's a certain middle section of policies, which I think with proper pressure could potentially persuade the government, the Sri Lankan government, to keep enough space open so that they can actually be beaten in a further election. I think that's really important. They're not going to want to, and they're tempted to do what they need to do to lock in their power forever. But I think with proper pressure, they might be willing to, you know, persuaded not to do that. In terms of China, I mean, increasingly my thought is China's with Sri Lanka, and the Sri Lankan government is with China regardless. I think it's very worrisome. I think particularly it's worrisome the lessons that the Chinese government might well be already passing on to the Sri Lankan government about how to control their populations, how to surveil them more tightly, how to rig the system in their favor. But so I mean, I understand the sort of the natural hesitation, perhaps, and perhaps the fear of pushing the Sri Lankan government towards China more by pressing them on rights and governance issues. But I think we've probably already lost that battle. I think it's more about how to counter Chinese influence and counter Chinese power and money, rather than sort of avoiding it getting too big. I think it's already they already put their cards down, and the Rajapaksas have, I think, put their cards on the, you know, they've each invested in each other and are committed to each other. The question is, what do we do about it in order to support, you know, a more peaceful and more rights-friendly and more democratic Sri Lanka?
To answer Laura's question about what sort of pressure could be brought on the Sri Lanka government, I have a couple of suggestions perhaps Congress could do. You know, specific congressional asks, like for instance, withholding direct funding to the Sri Lanka government until it adheres to time-bound human rights and justice benchmarks, I think is necessary. In the appropriations for the year 2021, there were benchmarks, but there were also many waivers. Congress should not go overboard, I think, with those waivers. The other thing is that the State Department has placed General Shavindra Silva on a list of travel sanctions. The House can call for the travel and other sanctions against other alleged perpetrators, such as Defense Secretary Kamal Gunaratne and other people like that. Coming to the Chinese, the issue of the Chinese, I agree with the others that China and Sri Lanka, at least its current leaders, are very close, and trying to disentangle that might be difficult. But that does not mean, as far as I can see, that pressure cannot be brought by Western governments, especially the US, because finally, Sri Lanka's elite who control Sri Lankan politics, and most of them are the single elite, still have greater affiliations, at least socially speaking. I mean, they still send their kids to the US for education. They still speak English and stuff like that. And the cultural relations between the two countries are very great. So I feel that due to that, although at a political level, there might be quite a bit of, strong links between the current regime and the Chinese government, other pressures can be used to persuade the elite, the Sri Lankan, the single elite who control politics, to have an influence on the regime, to soften and or to untie the strong links that now exist between the government of Sri Lanka and the Chinese. And one of those examples, I think, is how the Sri Lanka government has now agreed to take the loan from the International Monetary Fund. All these years, or at least for the last couple of years, it has been recalcitrant, it has been stubborn, and said, no, we are not going to get anything from the IMF because of its links to the US. But now, due to the pandemic and the state of the economy, they have agreed to that. So these things happen on for the regime because there are other pressures, like social pressures. I mean, at least the singular elite, who continue to put pressure on the Sri Lanka government, which means that some of these ties with the Chinese can be disentangled or dismantled. Which means that the US should try to continue to put pressure on the Sri Lanka government to change, rather than feeling okay, rather than abandoning everything, thinking that okay, the link between the Chinese and the Sri Lanka government is too close. Thank you.
I guess one more question from the chat box. This is for everybody. As the civilian government and institutions are being captured by the military, what are the first steps or first pressure points towards moving back to civilian government? So if any of our panelists have any thoughts on that last question.
So I think like one of the first steps is countries like the United States and others need to be consistent in their policies. So for instance, I mentioned that the US State Department had issued a travel ban against Shavendra Silva, but following his appointment to the head of the National Operating Center to prevent COVID-19, the US ambassador to Colombo, in fact, went and met with Shavendra and was photographed doing so. So that level of inconsistency doesn't actually demonstrate to the Sri Lankan military that these are hard conditions and that their encroachment on civilian authorities is actually going to be met with a reduction in military to military engagement, as well as diplomatic engagement. And so I think that would be my first kind of step, is to sort of say that governments need to be consistent in their policies. And it's not just the United States, it's several other international actors who are engaged in Sri Lanka in respect of military engagement. And then I think the second step is also to try and, again, to everyone's point, like ensure that there is enough room for dissent to occur in Sri Lanka so that there is the ability of civilian populations to push back against this militarization and this encroachment of the military, to really consider the economic impacts of maintaining such an oversized military in Sri Lanka, so that when loans are provided, there are conditions attached that speak directly to that issue. So those, I guess those would be my kind of two cents on that.
All right, hearing none. We are over 11 o'clock, so I'd like to wrap up. So thank you very much to all of our panelists for speaking with us today. Very important, informative presentations. Appreciate all of you being here, particularly from Sri Lanka, from London, Tissa from DC. And thank you again to everyone for joining us here today. If you are interested, if your boss is interested in joining the caucus, please reach out to me. And I'd be happy to give you more information on it. And thank you everybody else for listening. I hope you found it as informative as we did. So with that, I guess we will wrap up. So thanks very much, guys.
Okay, thanks everyone.